Reunion, Chapter 1, Part 1. Hey, can I get you something?
What would you be willing to get?
Sorry, ignore her. Coffee, too. The young, doe-eyed waiter does an admirable job at hiding his confusion as he leaves the two women to their silence and memories again. It had been a day like any other when Nadine Svobodova realized she was in a cult. Perhaps it was a bit chilly for June, maybe the raindrops were ever so slightly larger than usual and made their way towards the ground with more diligence and purpose. With a lot of mental strain, she can convince herself that the car exhaust had smelled of imperceptibly cheaper gasoline. But 12 years leave remembrances distorted, and there's no good reason why any of those things should have been true. Yet, at the same time, Nadine finds it impossible to conceive of the day as having looked or sounded or smelled normal. Not when the texture it has in her memory is anything but. It feels like torn fabric at the periphery of her mind, like a gap with frayed edges prompting the irresistible desire to dig at it with restless fingertips until it rips further. She had been 15 years old at the time. She still was when she went to present her escape plan before the woman now sat opposite her, though it feels odd to reconcile those two hers within such a meager time frame. Dissonant, as though she had aged just as many years in the intervening months. That night she had snuck out to see a movie, the title or topic of which she can't honestly claim to remember. Details don't tend to stick on days like this. They don't suit them in how real they feel, their pragmatic worldliness rolling off the surface like overly bulbous raindrops. She is rather certain she had not liked it very much, whatever it might or might not have been about. At one point the main character, a brooding and thoroughly useless man, attempted for one reason or another to infiltrate a cult. It was all very overplayed, of course, but when a priest with that second-nature customer service smile looking as though it were stapled onto his lips greeted him, something somewhere broke. When the priest led him to a sparsely decorated room with an oppressively low yellowed ceiling and catechism began to bleed from his mouth, Nadine could not help but notice. She could not help but disintegrate. She could not help but understand what her family, what she, was part of. That she was the other in this second-rate flick she had only snuck out to see out of habit. Of all the other things Nadine had felt in that moment, it was a small but nonetheless noticeable part that was angry at having come to the realization through this film that some talentless hack with a movie camera had made themselves responsible for her life unraveling. She felt like they did not deserve this kind of impact, that there was a certain cruelty to not being able to claim sole ownership over one's scars. It's a very silly thought, but sometimes the brain needs those to make sense of the big stuff, to cushion the existential crisis just enough to not be hit by a car on the way back, something the non-occurrence of which Nadine still finds surprising to this day. If the movie was a blur, then the trip home was a void, with only the fact that she did end up back at the compound as barely adequate proof of a journey that no synapse could be bothered to cling on to. It was her parents she confronted first. Children are stupid like that. They took great issue with the word cult, but with none of the actual cultism, or rather they didn't seem to see the problem with it. More than that, they looked confused, as though their daughter had just started throwing a tantrum about the sky being blue. It always had been, and why would its blueness suddenly be so upsetting? She neglected to mention how she had come to her conclusions, of course, not that it meaningfully helped. While her parents might not have listened, not properly, they still thought it necessary to inform a priest who followed her every step over the following weeks. Thus began the worst 3 months of Nadine's young life. The summer of ghosts, as she would later come to refer to it. She had convinced herself that she was on 2 vitally important twin missions, to find other people trapped in the compound and to escape. Perhaps there was a third unspoken objective, to survive, but she was an astronomical unit shy of in the best place mentally, and so put far less effort into that one. She barely ate, closely observed the routines of everyone in the community, and even dabbled in psychosis when her sleeplessness allowed for it. Everybody around her young self suddenly seemed more like a security camera than a person, like a robot, and she treated them as such, vigilant and mute. It was strange how quickly she had accepted this to be her life, being utterly alone and under constant surveillance. Needless to say, time passed slowly and wrought itself into repeating patterns. No one ever listened. The children were either too young to get what she was saying, or they, like the adults, did not see anything wrong with being in a cult. It was comfy here, wasn't it? She was unable to explain at the time in how many distinct ways that wasn't even remotely the point. Perhaps there might have been a person or two who would have understood. Nadine couldn't probe the entire compound. Even back then she had no delusions of pulling off a stunt like that. But the number of conversations was by no means insubstantial either. She littered her speech with vague allusions that were likely far more obvious than she imagined, and when someone responded in a way she considered promising, she would push it further, never to any avail. There was one person she had hopes for, though. Catherine Allen. It's not that she had ever spoken to the girl. It would have felt presumptuous, maybe sacrilegious even, but with Nadine standing within the Church of the Astral Plane as it was, she doubted trying would do her much additional harm now. Maybe she simply didn't care anymore. Difficult to say in hindsight, but it definitely wasn't a suicide mission. Now that she didn't fit in anymore, she could clearly see the same being true for Kath. The fact that a 13-year-old girl would be part of this organization without her parents had been a red flag from day one, a messiah who only ever stared at people. Occasionally she would hear stories of someone actually having an interaction with Catherine, and they always seemed shaken. At that point, Nadine still believed this to be the result of self-delusion, making lunatics perceive a normal girl as something alien, so she was profoundly unprepared when she cracked the lock to their chosen one's quarters one night. 2 cups of coffee. You want sugar with it?
You may keep the sweetener. It is as much yours by right and essence as it is unbecoming of mine. Thank you, and again, please ignore my friend.
Such an easy string of words to produce, a statement which quickly becomes reflex upon spending any time in public with Kath, and yet the task itself is utterly impossible to accomplish. Please ignore my friend. Please levitate in mid-air. Please list everything that exists in descending order of how much it looks like a Chinese mitten crab. After years of flip-flopping on whether this property was a gift or a curse, she has only come to the conclusion that there is no way of explaining the difference to Kath. So what does it matter? By no means could it be said that Nadine herself was ordinary or incapable of eliciting fascination. As a self-proclaimed witch, she considered it part of her job. And if one were to merely look at the 2 young women, Nadine would likely draw far more attention with her undercut, piercings, and various tattoos of arcane symbols. She could enthrall all she pleased, but she had to make an effort, where Kath could not help it, despite her far more homespun appearance. Only the eyes give it away, eyes which never closed. The door swung open with little resistance, and for a brief, annoying moment, there was something like surprise about her plan working, as though she hadn't been certain before. Inside it was dark, though no darker than the surrounding corridors, which meant that Nadine's eyes had no need to readjust. Most of the rooms in their compound looked the same, aside from interior decor, but she had still assumed their prophet's chambers to be more spacious. She had imagined a kind of miniature palace, perhaps with a chandelier or a fountain, something that absolutely didn't make sense architecturally speaking, but which was a conceptual necessity. Certainly there had to be more than just a room, a 4x3 boudoir with naked yellowed walls and an ant colony at the footboard of a plain children's bed with a girl set atop. Kids can have many reactions to someone entering their room at night. They might jolt upright, pretend to sleep, or simply continue doing whatever it is they were in the process of, depending on their disposition and general environment. When the person entering reveals themselves to be a stranger, they might scream. Nadine was aware of that possibility. They might also pull a blanket over their head and attempt with all their might to convince themselves of what a silly position philosophical realism is. Scarcely, though not never, to any avail. Blanket throwing, of course, is an intricate art, made yet more difficult by the enormous book in Catherine's arms, but Nadine had successfully executed maneuvers of the sort in her own bed on many occasions. No attempt was made despite this. No sounds of terror left the girl's mouth either. Her pupils merely darted upwards as though it were Christmas Day and she had just been presented with a new toy, leaving her previous activity utterly uninteresting. The church never had a Christmas tree to hide presents under, but it did have door frames, and so, that night, a frail being with curly black hair sat behind an ant colony, excitedly awaiting what her new plaything would do. And the plaything gladly obliged. It told its prophet of a tree stood conveniently close to the compound walls, of covert nightly excursions to the movie theatre, of watchful priests and weak-willed drones. Behind the veil of hair, wide eyes seemed to find delight in her words. Not the horror of realization that Nadine had hoped for, but far more of a reaction than she had gotten used to in her months of deprivation. Exhilaratingly so, enough for the toy to sing on as the child drank it all in.
Alright, are you really just gonna silently stare at me all day? I went through a lot of trouble finding you. It's strange. People claim that images are capable of saying more than 1,000 words, and yet they seem confused if you don't want to waste breath on the things light conveys more efficiently. Are they scared the shapes might give answers the tongue would not have? If so, that appears to be all the more reason to look. They might simply be aware that light and speech can be used at the same time. You're being facetious. Yes, we call them jokes. While I'm well aware that seeing isn't the same as looking, people may see a painting and carry on their conversation just fine, but really, looking at one has a habit of making them fall silent. I was hoping to actually catch up with you. Not all stories can be told visually. I guess the asymmetry makes it a bit unfair. You've put a lot more effort into telling the last few years on your body, so I got lost in reading them and failed to reciprocate.
She's right. Apart from some questionable outfit choices, Catherine looks exactly as Nadine imagined she would under that makeup. There's a scar just below her hairline, but that too might have always been there and merely concealed. She's the same down to the exaggerated head tilt. The hair, the eyes, the way she sits cross-legged on a chair. Maybe it's simply testament to Nadine not having known anyone over this sort of time span, but the self-resemblance seemed almost uncanny to her. Seldom unsure of what to say, the witch chuckles and points at one of her tattoos, a cursive rendition of the alchemical symbol for cinnabar. Oh, these are mainly marketing.
Shame, it's a compelling story they tell. And that's what good marketing is supposed to do, don't you think? I suppose it is. Very troubling.
What? That shapes fail to reveal information my tongue is willing to?
That stories should be untrue. I don't think it suits them, and I doubt they enjoy it. Like a spring, you can squish or stretch them, but they bounce back to being true, even if they weren't before. It would all be very precarious otherwise. Reality would be. Ontology is squishy, but specifically in the way of memory foam. At the very least metastable, dislodging the universe from that groove, much like ripping the spring, requires a considerable effort. Sure, but you can paint the spring or move it. Not all attributes are so punitive. I did say mainly, but I'd be surprised if you were able to figure out the composition just by staring. Maybe I can't yet. What would you want to hear? You know I'm bad at gauging what things are obvious. I still have no idea when you got out.